The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
JFK 35 is a production of the JFK Library Foundation. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the JFK Library Foundation staff, board, or donors, or the JFK Library. The material and information presented here is for general historical and educational informational purposes only. The views expressed in the podcast are not meant to imply any endorsement of or opposition to any organization or political party.
For of those to whom much is given, much is required.
When President Kennedy left Massachusetts for Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated the 35th President of the United States, he understood the responsibility that lay before him. This spring, we'll look at how to keep a democracy healthy by looking back at JFK's example. In this episode, we'll look at the 4 qualities of leadership Kennedy said are necessary for a healthy democracy. Coming up next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to this special season of JFK 35. Democracy requires elected leaders who understand the responsibility they hold. In a democracy, leaders represent the people who elected them into office, but they also represent citizens who voted for their opponents. At a speech at the Massachusetts State House, President Kennedy described the bonds between a country's leaders and its citizens as a sacred trust. In this special 4-part series, we will take a closer look at what made President John F. Kennedy a strong Democratic leader, not as a leader of the Democratic Party, but as President of the Democratic Republic of the United States. In this episode, we will return to the speech President Kennedy made in Massachusetts, now referred to as the City on a Hill speech. We will look at the 4 specific qualities of leadership Kennedy highlighted as essential for a healthy democracy. Joining me today and for the next 4 episodes is Harvard Kennedy School presidential historian and JFK biographer Fredrik Logevall. Fred has published the first of what will be a multi-volume edition of a complete biography of John F. Kennedy. The first volume is titled JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, and focuses on Kennedy's life from 1917 to 1956. The second volume is slated to appear in 2026. It has been so well received that Fred's work is serving as the inspiration for a new Netflix limited series on the life of John F. Kennedy. Fred, thanks for coming on and taking us through the next 4 episodes.
Delighted to be with you, Matt.
So in this podcast about lessons in democracy from President Kennedy, we're going to take a look at several parts of his administration and his life that can help us hopefully give us some wisdom into what being a democratic leader is all about. And in this first episode, we want to talk about the speech that President Kennedy gives right before he heads to Washington. It's at the Massachusetts State Capitol on Beacon Hill. And he gives this speech where he lays out 4 leadership qualities as he's about to head and take, the most highest office in the land. In that speech, let's begin with a very famous trait for us here at the library, which is courage.
First, were we truly men of courage, with the courage to stand up to one's enemies, and the courage to stand up when necessary to one's own associates, the courage to resist public pressure as well as private greed.
Let's just start with that quote. What's your reaction as far as that and how that is an important lesson for Democratic leaders today?
The thrust of the quote is striking. It's in part striking because, of course, he's about to become America's 35th president. This is a speech here at the Massachusetts State House, but it speaks to themes, or it articulates themes that Kennedy has really grappled with since his college days, just a few miles away from where he delivered the speech. Namely, what is the nature of political courage? What's involved? Why does it matter? That's in a sense what he's talking about here. And why is it central to democracy? I think he sees courage and democratic leadership as being intertwined. I think he sees history and an understanding of history as being intertwined. And so, in a sense, it seems to me that a historical sensibility and a conviction regarding the need for political courage come together in this speech.
Courage for President Kennedy obviously wasn't just, some buzzword that he threw around. It was a really important word for him. He spent time when he was in convalescence writing the book Profiles in Courage. Why do you think he chose to write that book when he did, and what was its purpose?
Well, when he was a student at Harvard, and when he then began to write his senior thesis, which became his first book, Why England Slept, it was clear that this young man was interested in the dilemmas of leadership, if I can put it that way. In particular, how can a leader in a democracy reconcile his conception of the nation's interest with his need to win the support of his constituents, the sometimes fickle demands of the voters any democratic leader will have to deal with and try to accommodate on some level if he or she is going to win an election. So this fascinated him, as I say, even from the time he was 20, 21 years old. And I think that the book that you refer to, Profiles in Courage, 1956, is a kind of natural outgrowth of this. I suggest in the first volume of my biography that there's a pretty straight line between the senior thesis and first book and Profiles in Courage, because he understands, even as a young man, that this is something that leaders are going to have to grapple with, that British leaders, for example, in the interwar period, never quite could, in Kennedy's judgment, never could, in a satisfactory way, figure out the tension between, again, the need to win election and to respond to often parochial constituent interests with a sense of what's best for the nation.
And, President Kennedy, a young senator, do you think there was a lack of courage at the time when he was in the U.S. Senate? Do you think he viewed things that maybe his fellow senators, lessons that he could learn or the rest of the Senate could learn? Do you think there was some sort of also modus there in the current American political situation of the 50s that influenced why he wrote this book?
It's a really interesting point. I think the answer to that is yes. And in fact, he didn't exclude himself from this need. In other words, I think he felt that liberals in the Democratic Party were suspicious of him, thought that he had not shown sufficient political courage during Joe McCarthy's rise to prominence, that he had failed to be a profile in courage. And so I think one motivation for writing the book, I'm not suggesting that it was, the motivation. Maybe it's a secondary one. But I think he wanted to respond to this criticism. And what better way to do that than to have a fairly short book in which you have a number of case studies, each one showing a senator who showed, in Kennedy's view, political courage at some point in the past, and suggest in a fascinating introductory chapter and then in the conclusion the broader takeaway about the importance of this political courage. What you see, among other things, which I find really fascinating, including in light of our own era, is a suspicion on the part of Kennedy of the extremes. It seems to me that he has misgivings both about the political left and the political right. The extremes on both sides of the spectrum, and that the courage, in a way, I suggest in my book, the courage that he most respects is the courage of those politicians who resist the extremes. So he's a centrist politically, John F. Kennedy, and that's the courage, in a sense, that he wants to, I think, extol in this book. And as I say, in also his previous, both his speeches and his previous writings on the subject.
Yeah, we hear him say, we talk about resisting the public pressure and, going into, as a president of the 60s, period of high protests. And then as well as that private greed, which, I'm not as familiar with, but I imagine as in every era, there are big business interests that he knew he was going to face in Washington.
No question. I think that he is, in a sense, anticipating, because in 1955, when the book is being written, it's published the following year, but it's really being drafted in 55, late 54 and 55. He doesn't know, Matt, that he's going to be president of the United States, obviously. But I think he's already anticipating what somebody who is president, could be him, but somebody who is president is going to face these pressures, which, as you say, come from, for example, the corporate world, from leaders of other governments, from ordinary citizens. In various domains, a leader is going to have to, at certain points, at key points, show what, again, Kennedy deems to be political courage. And if the leader does that, I think Kennedy argues in the book, he'll not only survive politically, but he'll thrive politically. Because voters, he suggests, will ultimately come to value, to endorse, to admire a leader who can show this quality.
And speaking of qualities, let's move on to the next one. So in this speech, in addition to courage, another quality is, we'll call, judgment.
Secondly, were we truly men of judgment, with perceptive judgment of the future, as well as of the past, of our own mistakes, as well as the mistakes of others, with enough wisdom to know what we did not know, and enough candor to admit it.
This seems really prescient nowadays, but why don't you talk about why this was another point of focus in this speech?
Well, I think what it speaks to, it is an extraordinary little passage in the speech. And again, it's, if you look at the rest of his speech making, as he ran for president, and now, of course, as he's about to assume the presidency, I think this is a consistent theme. And I think it goes to, it's closely connected with Kennedy's belief in the need for a historical sensibility. You know, it's telling to me that he had an interview in September of 1960, so just a few months before this speech, with Walter Cronkite, in which Walter Cronkite asks him, if you're elected in November, what quality will you bring to the White House? And what Kennedy says, the first thing he says, is a historical judgment, a understanding of the past, the rhythms of the past, a belief that leaders in the past and the actions of ordinary people in the past have something to teach us, and that what an understanding of the past will give you is judgment. It's also a kind of empathy. You can put yourself into the shoes of an adversary or an ally, but somebody you're dealing with, which is the heart of empathy. You can see things from their perspective. I think that's something that Kennedy believes history can teach you, and that's a kind of judgment. A certain humility that I think comes with, again, an understanding of the past. I won't say he's unique among American presidents, but he's relatively rare among American presidents in emphasizing the importance of learning from history and reading history. And of course, since he was a kid, often sick in bed, his favorite reading had been historical nonfiction, biographies, histories of statecraft and diplomacy. So this was something that really went back to Kennedy's early years.
Kennedy was a student of history. Were there examples of Democratic leaders who showed good judgment that you think JFK tried to emulate or at least see as role models?
He often referred back to Lincoln, and I think he had great admiration for Lincoln. Partly that was because of Lincoln's speech making. So he wanted, for example, Ted Sorensen, his important aide, as you know, to read Lincoln's speeches for that. But I think it's also an admiration for the judgment that Lincoln showed as leader at an absolutely critical moment in the nation's past. He had, in similar respects, to a certain respect for and a belief in some of the things that Teddy Roosevelt sought to do, and then what Franklin Roosevelt sought to do. He was not particularly, in a sense, close to FDR, though they interacted some when he was a young man, but he certainly respected the judgment that Franklin Roosevelt showed during his long and important period in the White House. And then I think you could also add to this list a kind of grudging admiration for Charles de Gaulle, a leader he often found difficult. That is the French leader. And of course, Winston Churchill is a kind of lodestar for Jack Kennedy from an early age.
Definitely people to emulate and think about.
Yeah.
In this quote where he says, enough wisdom to know that we did not know and enough candor to admit it, does strike back to our era today. But thinking about when President Kennedy said this, do you think there were also examples of not good judgment in leadership that maybe, he's kind of hearkening to? Because it almost sounds to me like, that seems really specific, as if maybe there have been examples in the past recently in President Kennedy's time where maybe people who didn't have the wisdom to know or admit their mistakes maybe put the country or maybe put democracy more at risk.
Yeah, I think in part he is referring here to both British leaders, maybe in particular British leaders, and to a lesser extent French leaders in the 1930s. Again, this is the focus of his senior thesis. This is what he studied in his last year in college and then produced this thesis about. And I think he finds British leaders in particular, because they are the key concern of the thesis, but to a lesser extent French leaders, lacking in this regard. And they didn't show, in confronting the threat posed in particular by Nazi Germany, to a lesser extent Mussolini's Italy, to a lesser extent, I think in Kennedy's view, Imperial Japan, but they didn't show the judgment that he now was extolling, that he had seen in other instances. So maybe it's primarily those leaders that he is referring to here indirectly and in a negative way.
Let's move on to the third quality in this speech, this really fantastic speech: integrity.
Third, were we truly men of integrity, men who never ran out on either the principles in which they believed or the people who believed in them, men whom neither financial gain nor political ambition could ever divert from the fulfillment of our sacred trust.
What's Kennedy talking about here?
Well, I think he's fundamentally talking about the importance of integrity in public leadership, that it is kind of the foundational principle from which all other attributes ultimately flow. I think that would be a fair summation. That it's, in other words, that it matters more than anything else. I think this was something he developed, it seems to me, at an early age. This came partly from his parents, maybe in particular from his mother, Rose. I think he got much of his interest in history and in politics and in government and sort of the essence of government from her, because, of course, she had grown up very much a political animal herself, watching and learning from her father, John Honeyfitz Fitzgerald, that is to say, Jack Kennedy's grandfather, and he was very close to his grandfather. So that notion of the central importance of integrity in political leadership, I think, is there from an early age. I think it's then deepened as young Jack Kennedy reads more, learns more. He travels in Europe, of course, as we know, in the beginning in a serious way in 1937. He's in Germany on the eve of World War II, sees up close, in other words, the consequences of political leadership in the lives of ordinary people in a way that I think few others, certainly in his age group, would have seen. And I think all of this, Matt, underscores for him, when you see the consequences of what ensues, the importance of integrity in leaders and how much democracy ultimately will depend on, the strength of democracy will depend on leaders having this integrity.
And, we talk about his early life. I want to go to World War II real quick, because I think this is part of his development for integrity, particularly the sacred trust, because President Kennedy in World War II sort of kind of felt that the leaders on high, right, the political leaders, the senators or the high generals and et cetera, sort of maybe not all of them thought about their consequences of their actions or et cetera. So does some of that bleed into, this integrity conversation, and particularly the sacred trust he talks about that a democratic leader would have when they're elected to that position?
Yeah, I think there's no question that his own experience in the war and in particular his combat experience in the South Pacific in 1943, especially, made a deep impression on him, as I'm sure it did on all the other young men who were serving alongside him. He was not, obviously, by no means unique in this regard. I think he came to have a skepticism about the decision making by military commanders. He came to have a skepticism about the utility of military force to solve political problems. But maybe more than that, and it goes to what you're suggesting here, he came to believe that there is a sacred trust and that the decisions that leaders make, both civilian leaders, ultimately in Washington in this case, but also military commanders, including local military commanders, is just of foundational importance. And it is incumbent, I think, in young Lieutenant Kennedy's view, it's incumbent upon those leaders, civilian and military, to always make judgments honestly as they can, on the basis of the best information they can, with the public welfare in mind. They're going to make mistakes. They're not going to be immune to, selfish, ambitions. He's not naive in this regard. But in a fundamental way, I think he believes and continues to believe. I believe he thought this until his dying day. That sacred trust was absolutely critical, and that any leader, in terms of American politics, had to commit himself to that trust. Kennedy's commitment to democracy and to the public trust did not, we should emphasize, preclude him from being a partisan Democrat. In other words, he understood that partisanship is part of politics. In fact, on some level, it's healthy for politics to have the two parties in the U.S. system. The two parties disagree, and he was capable. He was quite capable of bare-knuckle politics. So we should not lose sight of the fact that he and his colleagues were capable of partisan sparring. They engaged in it. But I think what's key with Kennedy was that he also grasped that compromise in democratic politics, compromise is necessary to a well-functioning society, again, in a democracy. And Kennedy understood that civility in the public realm prevents dehumanization. It helps you to see your political opponents as adversaries and not enemies. So it's a particular acknowledgement of the importance of partisanship, but also an emphasis on the need for a certain amount of bipartisanship, and that you're operating together, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're working for the betterment of the nation.
And the final quality to touch on here, we'll call dedication. In this part of the speech, he says,
"Finally, were we truly men of dedication, with an honor mortgaged to no single individual or group, and compromised by no private obligation or aim, but devoted solely to serving the public good and the national interest."
Again, in today's era, I think these words ring very, very important. But what was Kennedy saying here in the 1960s about democratic leadership?
I think what he's saying is that all of us as human beings are going to have selfish motives. So, if we're a political candidate, we're going to do what's best for us in terms of trying to ensure our election or perhaps our re-election. But when push comes to shove, when that political candidate is having to make a decision based on what might be best for him in the moment and what's best for the society that he's leading, he's got to opt for the latter. So it is a dedication to the public interest, or you could say the national interest, especially if you're talking about foreign policy. And I think This was not something that was negotiable as far as John F. Kennedy was concerned. And I think it's fair to say that this was a point of view that many men and women of his generation felt. I don't want to for a moment suggest that he was somehow uniquely committed to this. I think there was a kind of idealism, I guess is what it is, that many in Kennedy's generation, including many who served in the war, felt about public service, what was involved in public service, why one should commit oneself to public service. I think many of them shared this, the so-called greatest generation. And Kennedy certainly did. He had gotten some of this, again, I think, from his parents, to some extent his grandparents. He had honed this commitment, this interest in this commitment in his reading, in his studies in college. As we're saying here, I think his wartime experience mattered a lot. And it also mattered then when he enters politics, first in 1946 in his race for the House, then in seeking a Senate seat successfully in 1952, and then ultimately culminating in his epic presidential run in 1960.
And just to finish this conversation off, again, as it's a lesson in democracy podcast, imagine President Kennedy giving this lecture almost on these principles. What is the danger for democracy when politicians don't have these principles, these core principles that President Kennedy is speaking of here?
Well, the danger, I suppose, is the obvious one, which is that they allow, and it's, I think, quite easy for this to happen, they allow their personal motivations, their personal interests to crowd out what is best for the nation at large. And again, we can go back to that senior thesis and the dilemma at the core of that senior thesis in the first book, and then also the core of Profiles in Courage. How does a leader reconcile his conception of the public interest and of the national interest with what's necessary to advance his own political career? There will be dilemmas there, and there will be difficult decisions. And how, I think for Kennedy, the question is, how can a leader win election, because that's ultimately what being a politician is about, while also being resolutely committed to pursuing the national interest? That is, I think, a core question for John F. Kennedy, both then and later.
Well, we're going to continue to talk about the later further on in this series as we go through some parts of the president's administration as he tries to work on this theory of how to be a democratic leader. And we're looking forward to more episodes. Thanks for starting this off really strong, Fred, and look forward to having you in the next episode.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to our first episode of Lessons on Democracy by JFK 35. If you're interested in learning more about some of the material we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or find us on social at JFKLibraryFDN using the hashtag JFK35. If you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.